Hi, and welcome back. I want to speak for a few moments about written contracts. When we talk about some contracts needing to be written, we're referring to the statute of frauds. The statute of frauds comes from early English law. Before the statute of frauds, all oral agreements were held to be enforceable. To prove the terms of the oral agreement, witnesses to the alleged agreement came forth to tell the court what the parties said. We know this is unreliable as far as evidence is concerned and open to all types of fraud, duress, undue influence, and just plain lying from witnesses. There are a lot of exceptions to the general rule about written contracts. Ironically, because of all the exceptions to the general rule, England has done away with the statute of frauds, and although it is still in effect here in the US, there are many holes in the general rule regarding exceptions that it is conceptually like a piece of Swiss cheese. Today, most contracts that are made verbally are acceptable to the courts. But these contracts are subject to problems when it comes to proving the terms of the agreement. So let's talk about 5 types of situations where we know we must have a written contract. Then we will talk about the exceptions to the rule as well. There are 5 types of contracts that must be in writing to be enforceable. Contracts transferring any real property rights, contracts that cannot be completed within 1 year, promises to pay the debt of another, promises in consideration of marriage, and under the UCC, contracts for the sale of goods for $500 or more. Okay, first let's talk about contracts transferring real property rights. A contract for the sale or lease of any interest in land must be in writing to be enforceable. If the contract has to do with real estate, leasing property, renting an apartment, subletting an apartment, buying or selling property, giving an easement, selling mineral or oil rights, a mortgage contract, or anything with real property, it has to be in writing. Why? Because real estate is a high stakes proposition. Property ownership is a fundamental right of all citizens. Property is incredibly valuable. The buying and selling of property rights can be high drama and is highly susceptible to fraud. Property transfer can be for a long term and can include many parties. To keep everyone's rights to the property straight, all the transfers need to be in writing. So, for example, Jane owns 100 acres of farmland. She allows Ned to farm on 10 acres. Jane allows J&B Excavation to mine for minerals on her land. She sells her neighbor Kelly an easement so that Kelly can reach the highway from her property. Jane wants to sell the entire 100 acres to the town of Cary. Who has what rights? Keeping all of this straight would be impossible without written contracts for each transfer. Here's the exception to this rule. Full performance by the seller. If the seller and the buyer orally agree to transfer interest in land and the seller hands over the deed or title to the land, this is considered full performance by the seller. The buyer may not then try to get out of the contract by saying there was no writing. The court would enforce this verbal agreement for the transfer of real land even without a written contract. Another exception is part performance by the buyer. The buyer of land may be able to enforce an oral contract if she paid part of the price or down payment for the land and either entered the land or made improvements to it. Improvements can be to build a structure on the land or put up a few shingles. Another exception is promissory estoppel. If the promisor makes an oral promise that should reasonably cause the promisee to rely on it, and the promisee does rely, the promisee may be able to enforce the promise. For example, you let me sublet your apartment because you're moving out of town for a new job. I give up my apartment and move into yours. The job doesn't work out, and you move back and demand I move out. I relied on the fact that you were going to let me have a leasehold interest in your apartment and reasonably relied on your promise. I may be able to argue promissory estoppel to be able to keep the apartment. Another type of contract that must be in writing to be enforceable is a contract that cannot be completed or fully performed within 1 year. If the terms of the contract make it impossible for the contract to be completed in 1 year, the contract must be in writing. For example, an offer of employment for the next 3 years. It will take 3 years to complete this contract. The terms of the contract itself make it impossible for the contract to be completed in 1 year. Therefore, this contract must be in writing to be enforceable. This would be the consequence of not having a written contract in this fact pattern. Employer and employee had no written contract for 3 years of employment, only a verbal agreement. The employer tells the employee to take a hike for no reason after 1 year. Employee sues on the verbal agreement to keep his job. What's the result? The employee loses because the contract was not in writing. It could not be performed within 1 year, so it must be in writing to be enforceable. If, on the other hand, the contract could be performed within 1 year, it does not have to be in writing. An example would be Susan agrees to redecorate Nancy's house for $20,000. Once Susan begins, the decorating will take 8 months to complete. Nancy cannot move into her new house until the Jaspers move out. This means that Susan cannot begin decorating until the Jaspers move out. The Jaspers are supposed to vacate the house within 2 to 5 months. If the Jaspers leave in 2 months, Nancy can move in and Susan can start decorating. The contract would be completed in 10 months from the time it was entered into, so no need for a written contract. But if the Jaspers move out in 5 months, this makes the time from the date the contract was entered into plus the time that the contract could be completed at least 1 year and 1 month. The contract could not be fully completed in less than a year. 5 months to start plus 8 months to complete equals 13 months, more than 1 year. The lesson here is that you have to look at the terms of the contract carefully to see if there is any possibility that the contract could be performed within 1 year. Why do we have this rule? Long ago, long-term contracts are subject to memory loss and loss of destruction of evidence of the agreement. Testimony of things that occurred further in the past, long ago, becomes less and less reliable when it was not written down. Another situation where we need a writing is for contracts by one party to pay the debt of another. Have you ever had someone co-sign a loan for you? This promise is called a guarantee, and the person who signed are called guarantors or co-signers. In this case, that person is promising the lender that if you do not pay for the loan, they will. How easy would it be to go to a car dealership and tell the dealer verbally, "Oh yeah, and my dad said that if I don't pay for this car, then he will." Your dad never made such a promise. You stopped paying for the car, and now your innocent dad is stuck footing the bill. Because the highly suspect nature of these agreements, to be liable for another person's debts, the law requires that these agreements be in writing. This is to protect the co-signer from fraud. Your dad is not benefiting financially from this arrangement. In fact, he may lose a lot of money. Usually people co-sign to help out the borrower. They do it out of the goodness of their hearts. But there is an exception to this rule. It is called the leading object rule. So what if the co-signer is not doing it to help the borrower out? What if he was co-signing to benefit himself, not the person obtaining the loan? Then would the agreement have to be in writing? If the co-signer is gaining a financial advantage for himself, would he more than likely agree to pay the debt of another? Is it more believable to the court that he would agree to co-sign to get something for himself? Yeah. This is what the leading object rule says as well. In the leading object rule, the court looks to the reason the guarantor or co-signer agreed to obligate himself for another's debts. If the promise to pay another's debts is made to obtain some financial gain for the co-signer, there is no need for there to be writing to enforce the contract. For example, the Scottish Inn depends heavily on Hometown Bakery to supply its pastries for its breakfast trade. By using Hometown Baker, they pay 50% less than they would from any other bakery. But what if Hometown Baker is in financial trouble with its sugar supplier? So Scottish Inn verbally agrees to Hometown's sugar supplier. They make this promise over the phone and without anything in writing. They say if Hometown does not pay the supplier, they will pay the bill. How does the Scottish Inn benefit from this agreement? The Scottish Inn benefits from this arrangement because Hometown stays in business and the inn keeps the supply of pastries at 50% off. The Scottish Inn's objective is making the contract is to benefit itself, not Hometown Bakery. So what if Hometown defaults on the loan? The sugar supplier goes to the Scottish Inn for payment. The inn refuses and claims it never agreed to pay. They also claim there was nothing in writing to support the supplier's claim. The sugar supplier takes Scottish Inn to court for payment of Hometown's debt. At trial, the court would look at the situation and decide it is more likely that the Scottish Inn did in fact agree to pay Hometown's debts so that the Scottish Inn could keep getting its pastries at such a low price. This agreement did not have to be in writing, and it is enforceable. The inn must pay the sugar supplier what Hometown owes it. The inn can later go to Hometown to be repaid, but it would have to pay the sugar supplier. Next are contracts in consideration of marriage. An example would be prenuptial agreements. Prenups must be in writing to be enforceable. They must also be agreed upon before marriage, not after the marriage has occurred. A prenup is a promise made in consideration of marriage. Let's say Elizabeth, a multimillionaire, wants to marry her stableman, Ives. The two agree that if Ives will marry Elizabeth, Ives will be entitled to the beach house and $500,000 upon any divorce that may occur. Ives is giving up his right to an equitable distribution. That means an equal split in the assets of the marriage. And Elizabeth is giving up her beach house and money. They are both giving up their status as single people. The last written contracts required are those that fall under the UCC, contracts for the sale of goods for $500 or more. The rule is more for business efficiency. Requiring some form of writing in sales contracts over $500 helps businesses move more efficiently. They are not spending time and money in court battling over millions, even billions of business transactions that are occurring all over the country. The court would have to engage in the business said, the customer said debates all day long if that were the case. The writing does not have to be a formal document either. A simple sales receipt will suffice. Now the exception to the rule. The exceptions that the UCC has carved out as far as written sales of goods contracts are designed to prevent or reduce these types of problems. So here are some of the exceptions to the writing requirement. Verbal contracts for the sale of goods of $500 or more will be enforced in the following situations. This is called the merchant exception to the rule about goods over $500 being sold must have a written contract. The exception goes like this. If one merchant sends a written confirmation to the other, and the confirmation is definite enough to bind the sender herself, then the merchant who receives the confirmation will also be bound by it unless he objects in writing within 10 days. So, for example, Maggie, sales executive for Maggie Moo's Ice Cream, calls Big City Dairy to purchase $1,000 worth of heavy cream to be shipped the same day. Big City Dairy sends Maggie a fax 5 minutes later confirming Maggie's order. Maggie does not object to the terms in the confirmation. The contract is now valid even without being in writing. Why? The relationship is merchant versus merchant, no consumer protection issues here. The written confirmation allows some proof. The exception allows business transactions to move efficiently. We don't have to draw up a formal written contract for every sales transaction. A written confirmation will be enough. Other exceptions to this rule are when the seller of the goods is specially manufacturing the goods for the buyer and the goods cannot be resold on the open market, or the defendant admits in court proceedings that there was a contract for the sale of goods, or the goods have already been delivered or they have already been paid for. Okay, so let's talk about the contents of a writing. What does the writing need to have in it to be enforceable? The statute of frauds requires that the agreement be in writing and nothing more. The statute of frauds, the agreement says the agreement can be embodied in letters, memos, telegrams, receipts, checks, purchase orders. For example, it's been held that a check given for the purchase can satisfy the requirements of a writing. The check identifies the parties, and is signed by one party on the front and the other party on the back. Some additional terms are needed in the memo line of the check that set forth the terms of the contract, identify the subject matter, and the agreed price. The writing can be written on any surface suitable for the purpose of recording the intentions of the parties. A rock, a tree, a napkin, a paper towel can all be a writing, and even a videotape, and maybe an audio tape. To be complete, written contracts should contain the terms of the agreement to a reasonable degree of certainty, including names and identities of the parties. The writing needs to be reasonably clear and complete so that if there is a breach, the judge in the case can fashion a remedy for one of the parties. This is the place now where we need to talk about a special rule called the parole evidence rule. Parole evidence refers to anything apart from the written contract itself that was said, done, or written before the parties signed the agreement or as the parties signed the agreement. Another term we need to look at when talking about the parole evidence rule is the term an integrated agreement, which means that the parties intended their written contract to be the final, complete expression of their entire agreement. Written contracts can come about after months of negotiating and drafting several agreements. So when we're talking about written agreements and what the parties intended to do in those written agreements, we are looking only to the final written agreement, and we are not going to give weight to all the prior drafts and negotiations that occurred before the final agreement or during the signing of that final agreement. So now, let's look at the rule itself. The parole evidence rule states when two parties have an integrated contract, neither one may use parole evidence to contradict, vary, or add to the terms of the integrated contract. Now, of course, in cases where the written agreement is incomplete or is not an integrated agreement, oral evidence may be used to supply the missing terms. But here we are talking about integrated agreements. So with an integrated agreement, following the verbal negotiations and discussions, the parties will put the agreement in writing. Once this is done, only the terms, conditions, and promises included in the writing itself will be allowed as evidence in court. This is because the court presumes that the parties have put everything they agreed to in writing. If they went through all the trouble of reducing everything to writing, then anything that is material or important to the parties should be included in that writing. If it was not important enough to include in the writing itself, the court will usually hold that the outside oral or written statements or actions are not important enough to be considered as evidence. Now that we have stated the rule, we of course have to state the exceptions. Courts will allow parole evidence to show that the contract is void or voidable due to lack of mutual assent or contractual capacity, fraud, or duress. So, for example, while discussing the sale of Tom's motorcycle, Tom and Mary have the following discussion. "Boy, Tom, you sure seem better. How is your schizophrenia these days? Do you still have a guardian?" Tom replies, "Yeah, but he's a pain in the butt. I don't need a stupid guardian. I can make my own decisions. The voices I hear in my head are guardian enough." Then they write down, Tom agrees to sell Mary his only motorcycle for $15,000 on Tuesday, October 23rd. This is our complete agreement. Signed, Mary and Tom. We are now in court. Tom wants to introduce their verbal conversation to get out of his agreement with Mary. Can he? Yes. The purpose is not to add to, vary, or contradict the written agreement, but is to show lack of capacity. The UCC allows parole evidence about how the parties have done business together over a long period of time. This is called course of dealings. Parties that have established a long-term business relationship get so used to dealing with each other in a particular way that they often skip including certain terms in their written agreements. The court will allow parole evidence to supply those missing terms. The testimony is reliable because the parties can show how they have always done business together in the past. It makes sense that they would do business the same way this time, more likely than not. Okay, well, that is all for now. Please make sure you keep reading and do not hesitate to call me with any questions you may have. Until next time, check you later.